welcome back. And again, another shout out to Cassidy on the music selection there. There's definitely an opportunity to create a customized playlist, I think. Thank you all for coming back. I hope you had a great networking session. And welcome to our last session of the day. But do remember that there's going to be another final networking opportunity after this. So make sure to stick around for that. And a big shout out again to Slalom, our title sponsor and very innovative global consultancy. And don't forget to head on over to the sustainability shop located to your left, whichever direction that looks like, to get your own limited edition water bottle. And the proceeds are going to go directly to Virtue Lab thanks to our sponsor, Core. I've had a wardrobe change, moving from the dress shirt for bicycles to this bicycle. Hope you enjoy it. And for those tracking the different pillow back there, shout out to all of the folks in the 404 in Atlanta, my hometown. But today, I'm very excited because in this session, we're going to hear from 4 unique perspectives on the transition to clean energy and how we can green the grid and electrify everything to reach our emission reduction targets. And to kick it off, I'm going to introduce Shimul Bajor, the Climate Impact Fund Fellow at Virtue Lab, who is moderating this session and an incredibly impressive individual. Shimul has a master's degree in environmental management from Yale University and has experience working with a range of sustainability initiatives, from evaluating government business partnerships for ecotourism and designing policies for marine protected areas with the Action Foundation, to assessing sustainable architecture and cooling technology with sea balance solutions, measuring the impacts of equity investments in aquaculture innovation with Hatch. Shimul, congratulations, and it's an honor to have you today. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Miguel, and thank you all for joining us today. If we were all in person right now, we'd be seeing everyone kind of take their seats and look around, introduce yourselves to your neighbors. And that's hard to do on Zoom, but we'd still love to meet you all. And so if you can, please introduce yourselves in the chat. I'm sure everyone would like to know who else is in the room. We'll also make sure to save a few minutes at the end of this session for audience questions. And so if at any point you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat in the Q&A box on the bottom left of your screen. All right, so I'm sure everyone at this event is fairly tuned into the climate crisis, but I wanted to highlight the kind of urgency of it. And in the most recent IPCC report, some of the key takeaways were that CO2 levels are at an all-time high. Our natural resources have never been this strained before. And even in our best case scenario, we will end up overshooting the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark by 2030 if we continue with our current practices. And so it's becoming fairly obvious that we need radical change and a transformation in the way that we're using resources and functioning as a society. And so this means that we need innovation. We need to invest in this innovation, deploy it at scale, and we need these solutions to be equitable and to reach the communities that are most affected by climate change. So in this panel, we'll talk specifically about 2 strategies of attacking the climate crisis: decarbonizing the grid and electrifying everything. So that's moving all processes away from the emission-intensive burning of fossil fuels. And we're lucky to be joined by 3 industry experts that are leading the innovation and deployment of these strategies. And they bring 3 unique perspectives. So we'll hear about Rochelle's experience with deploying these solutions and innovations and broad market trends with the National Lab, Raphael's experience with utilities and bringing clean energy solutions to communities, and Jane's expertise and experience with innovation and bringing about a unique solution to decarbonizing homes. And I have the privilege of being a part of this conversation as someone who grew up in South Asia, where the effects of climate solutions, the effects of climate change are an everyday lived experience. And so I'm really excited and fortunate to be hearing from 3 leaders who are leading the efforts to make the future a better place for all of us. So without further ado, I'm going to let the panelists introduce yourselves, and why don't you tell us a little more about your work and the background that you bring to this conversation. And Rochelle, if you'd like to start us off, we can then head to Jane and Raphael.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shamal. Thank you so much for being part of this panel today. It's a pleasure. Hi, everyone. My name is Rochelle Ely. I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is one of DOE's 17 national labs across the country. We have a focus on energy efficiency and renewable energy research. I work in our Innovation and Entrepreneurship Center, which we often refer to ourselves as the front door. So we work with a lot of investors, entrepreneurs, startups, foundations, you name it, kind of bridging the gap between some of the lab's capabilities and the market transformations on the outside. I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Rochelle. Jane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So I'm Jane Melia. I'm the CEO and founder of Harvest Thermal. So we're a startup based in, founded in California, and our mission is to really help get gas out of homes and transition to clean electric heating and hot water. My background is that of an engineer, but I have 20 years of business experience, primarily in the startup field. So energy, solar energy, energy storage, solar cells, as well, before founding Harvest Thermal just about 2.5 years ago. We talk a lot about cleaning the grid, and that is essential as we fight climate change. But nearly 70 million households in the US are actually burning fossil gas or fuel oil inside their homes for heating up water, and that's generating a lot of emissions as well. So that's the second problem that we need to address. So when we talk about home electrification, a lot of what we're talking about is how do we address heating and hot water, and how do we get that to be clean and electric? And so I look forward to a discussion about different ways to do that today. Thank you.
My name is Rafael Reyes. I'm Director of Energy Programs for Peninsula Clean Energy. Peninsula Clean Energy is the community choice aggregator or community choice energy program covering San Mateo County, California, and soon portions of the Central Valley. For those of you not familiar with CCAs, we are public agencies responsible for providing the generation service for our service territories. We were founded in 2016 with a mission to provide cleaner power at lower rates and drive decarbonization in our region. And I'll talk more about that later. But my background includes originally 15 years in high tech before I made a transition into the clean energy space, where I've been for the last 20 years. And prior to joining Peninsula Clean Energy in 2018, I was with a clean tech incubator called Prospect Silicon Valley, where I led and supported some $80 million in projects and programs around the San Francisco Bay Area, with a heavy emphasis on emerging technologies, as well as particularly transportation, but also building technologies. And I want to thank Virtue Lab and Shmuel for driving this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Raphael, Jane, and Rochelle, for joining us today. I'm overwhelmed by the experience that you bring to the conversation and looking forward to hear more. Rochelle, you talked about how with your work, you interact with a number of different players, industry experts, entrepreneurs, researchers. So I think you have a good understanding of broad market trends. And can you talk us through some of the changing market trends around electrification, and what are some of the big energy users that are going to be hard to electrify? And are you seeing any innovations that are helping address some of these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. Related to some of the large energy users or more difficult users to electrify, I would name certainly buildings, the transportation sector, not so much because we don't have EVs or the capability to build out EVs, but rather the infrastructure that's needed. And that's true for hydrogen cars as well. And then the industrial sector will be equally difficult to decarbonize and electrify, if you will. One of the programs here in the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Center at NREL, we have an incubation program called the Shell Game Changer Accelerator, powered by NREL. And one of our latest cohort calls was on industrial electrification. So we hope to announce those companies later this fall. So for specific solutions there, stay tuned. So you could see some promising startups in that space.
And can you expand a little more on how the National Lab supports researchers and also entrepreneurs and innovations and kind of helps develop some of those to a deployable level?
Certainly, yeah, the US Department of Energy National Labs really are the cornerstone of early stage energy R&D, really the powerhouse for some of those energy transformations. And so, yeah, we work with researchers, from early stage all the way down to more commercial later stage. And often our researchers file intellectual property or patents that can be licensed to the outside community, whether that's industry, startups, whomever. And then we also facilitate startup incubation through what we call here at NREL tech incubation, which is we work closely with a selected startup as part of our programs to test and validate their solution. So from the startup's perspective, they get access to the world-class expertise, facilities, and capabilities of NREL, and really get an extension of a team dedicated to their development. I'm happy to chat more on those later, but don't want to hog the time.
Yeah, so you mentioned that buildings, EVs, and the industrial sector were kind of the big users that need focus, and utilities definitely play a big role in how energy is distributed and access to energy. And so, Rafael, would you like to talk about Peninsula Clean Energy's approach to decarbonization, and what would you say greening the grid means, and is 100% green grid possible, and what are the key needs that that we need to make that happen?
Sure, and I'll talk a little bit about the grid side issues and then the distributed side, which is more my focus. But Peninsula Clean Energy has two top-level strategic goals. One is renewable energy on a 24/7 basis, and the second is supporting our region and meeting its comprehensive decarbonization by 2045. So we actively are working on both of these. Obviously, we're trying to move with both urgency and sense of the importance of equity. On the grid side, we're spending intensive attention on this now. The short story is, of course, that you either need to move the generation to where the demand is, or move the demand to where the generation is, in terms of timing. And so obviously scaled storage is going to be a big part of that. We have active procurement around solar and wind and other resources. And storage is going to have to be a big part to fill in the gaps. You can do some of that gap filling by over procuring, meaning you buy more solar, just to take it in simplistic terms, and the shoulders of the solar, in the morning and evening hours get bigger, so you can cover a little more that way. But you have a lot of excess solar, so just from an economic standpoint, that is helpful, but there are some limitations to that. And then you have to look at where to optimize the deployment of storage. Today's storage is dropping in cost, but it's still extremely expensive when you look at it at large scales. And lithium ion is good for 4 hours has been the convention, and it might move into 6 and 8 hours maybe. But the reality is that you're not going to move to larger scales more than likely on lithium ion. So in the long run, when you look at the full range of what 24/7 means, is you're going to have to take a look at other technologies also. So we're seeing, based on our preliminary analysis, that costs climb dramatically as we move from 90% time coincidence up towards 100. And that's because of the cost constraints associated with lithium ion. So we have a number of other efforts in the works on the procurement side, including a partnership with Forum Energy where they're piloting their systems today. Some of you may have heard of Form Energy, which is bringing in alternative chemistries and aiming for very aggressive price points for very long duration, 100-hour batteries. So looking longer term, we're very excited about those sorts of initiatives. And I'll turn it back over to you, Shimul, but happy to speak more on the distributed side when the time permits.
Yeah, I had kind of a follow-up question. Can you talk a little more about what the role of innovation is in your work, and how, if at all, do you interact with new solutions that are coming up in the clean energy space?
Sure. So, you know, on one level, our programs are very similar to what you would normally think of as utility-based programs. You know, we have incentives for vehicles, we have incentives for heat pump water heaters, and other measures along those lines. But there are several things about community choice energy programs that provide for, frankly, unique opportunity to really drive innovation at scale. Taking a half step back, if you look at the need for market transformation, really there are four big things. You've got to have public motivation, you have to deal with costs, you have to address the supply chain barriers, and you have to have a lot of capital. And so the four areas where we really are focusing on our attention are A, speed. We're not subject to the Public Utilities Commission, California Public Utilities Commission. We're subject to our own board. So we think in terms of weeks, not months or years in terms of execution. Methods are incredibly important. So earlier, Rochelle made reference to EV charging and scale of EV charging and what's needed. One of the things that we've been very focused on is the costs of EV charging are directly related to the fact that we've got a very traditional notion of what an EV charging system looks like. Oh, it has to be a level 2 charger in a box, and it looks like this, and so on and so forth. When in fact, most of people's charging needs does not require a 40 amp circuit. So we've been driving low power solutions, power management solutions, and looking at cost, a fraction of the cost so you can go to 3 to 4 times as many ports for the same dollar value as a traditional charger installation. And in fact, we just got in a request for 88 ports at an affordable housing provider, and that's going to be mostly level 1 and power managed level 2, just to take that as an example. And then that trickles over to policy, where we're helping drive reach codes based on the same sort of methodology, and then on technology. So we have a strong opportunity to bring in technologies that are ready to enter the market. We have a number of pilots underway in level 1 charging, EV telematics-based managed charging. I mentioned the partnership with Form Energy, and we also have a partnership with Harvest Thermal, and are very excited about the prospects of lowering install costs, improving operating costs, and aligning demand and supply.
Yeah, and let's take that as a cue to hear more about Harvest Thermal. And so, Jane, you mentioned earlier that nearly 70 million homes rely on fossil fuels, and I recently read that we're adding about 1 million new homes every month, and so that means that we're already the building sector is already contributing over 10% to US greenhouse gas emissions, and these homes are going to last for a while, and the appliances that we install, the heating appliances, are going to last for a while. So every time we build a new house with fossil fuel reliance, it's kind of, we're locking in those emissions. So what are your thoughts on electrifying everything in the context of space and water heating? And do you think fully electric homes are possible? And what do we need to get to fully electric homes?
Great question, thank you, Shimul. And to be able to address that question, there are actually a number of problems that need to be solved. But first of all, just to step back as to why the Harvest Thermal team really took on this challenge. And this was, 4 years ago, just in my own house, I had an old and aging gas furnace. And having worked in clean energy and being aware of the issue of climate change, I did not want to replace it with a gas furnace. And I was looking for alternatives. And I found that there are a lot of challenges for homeowners who are trying to move away from electricity. Unfortunately, there's an upswing in innovation and development, which is providing more options. But certainly there are difficulties in that transition that we're all working to resolve. And for me, there are kind of two main questions that we really try to grapple. First of all, if you want to move away from gas for your heating and gas for your hot water, how do you do so in such a way that supports a strong, resilient electric grid? Heating in particular is mostly needed in the mornings or in the evenings, and that's when renewables are less available on the grid. So you end up using electricity when it may be delivered by a gas peaker plant, which is not as clean as you would like, and it's also expensive for the utility. So that is a challenge. It's that demand supply challenge that Rafael was referring to earlier. And one of the key approaches to that is you need to shift that load, right? How do you find a way to shift that load and do so in a way that's affordable? Secondly, is how do you make it cost effective to buy, to install, and to operate? You know, we need solutions that are scalable, that are equitable, and that for all our benefits, that get the vast majority of our homes off these fossil fuels. And so that's really thinking about the product from first principles. How do you minimize the equipment that you're installing? You know, maybe just instead of having 2 heat pumps or more, get just 1 heat pump. How do you minimize the form factor so it doesn't just fit into large homes, but can fit into a tank closet for the smaller homes, so that we can really scale it? And of course, how do you make it comfortable and quiet and safe so that people are willing to adopt it? One thing that we found works extremely well in this space, and really I think is going to help scale this activity, is decoupling the demand from the supply, and do that for thermal loads using thermal storage. Electrochemical batteries are fabulous for shifting electric loads. The nice thing about thermal batteries is they're very, very good at shifting thermal loads. So they can store hot water for a significant amount of time. They have a good throughput efficiency. They don't degrade over time. They're super safe and stable. So I think for this space, and I can see increasing innovation in here, is let's work on using these high performance heat pumps that move energy rather than generating it. So they're already 4 or 5 times more efficient than the best gas burners. Use those at times of day when there's a lot of renewables on the grid. And so it doesn't hurt the CCAs or the utilities. They've got plenty of electricity. Store that up in a thermal battery and release that heat when people need it. It's safe, it's affordable, it allows the homeowners to capture the lowest rates and really helps us all make that transition. So I do believe that we can do this. First of all, that is, when people burn fossil fuels in their home, it is primarily for heating and hot water. That represents 90% of the problem. So in a way, that's nice. We find a solution for that. We have solved a large part of that problem. But also, it's a problem that we have been able to solve in the past. I was trying to remember the numbers, but I think about 12 years ago, LEDs represented less than 0.5% of each sale of lamp bulb. Now they represent well over 50%. Similarly for solar power, over a course of 10 years, we made a huge transformation in the cost, but also the acceptability and deployment of solar. We can absolutely do the same for electrification. And I think that's what a number of us are working on.
That's
so
really
I could carry on,
exciting.
but I want to give you a chance to ask more questions for either myself or the other panelists.
Yeah, happy to hear anything that you need to add as well. And feel free to jump into or add to anyone else's questions and answers. It also sounds like the consumer behavior plays a big part of adoption. And I like what you said about how we need to kind of shift our energy demand to suit or to be more kind of facilitative towards electric, all electric processes. So Rafael, can you share a little more about your thoughts on adoption? And Jane, feel free to add. Are you seeing any programs and strategies that really make a difference in consumer behavior with respect to energy consumption?
With respect to energy, so I think, well, from the standpoint of electrification, which is our principal focus, it's very early days. So we at the beginning of this year launched a heat pump water heater incentive program. It's pretty plain vanilla from an incentive program standpoint. We're using that to start gathering some information about the state of the market, I mentioned the 4 big barriers, right? Public motivation, cost, supply chain, capital. And the building sector is now a much more difficult problem, in my view, than transportation. Transportation is still a big problem, but building is an even bigger problem. And the reason is that on the vehicle side, just putting aside the infrastructure, but on the vehicle side, the economics are becoming, totally clear. The automakers are committed. You're getting true market momentum around that, and that's going to have an enormous, create enormous force within the market overall. We need to make it happen faster, and we need to open up areas where there are barriers, particularly for folks in multifamily, apartments and condos and the like, and low income. So infrastructure continues to be important. On the building side, particularly in California, where we're a high utility, mostly a high utility rate region, the economics of building electrification are just not great. It's more or less a wash, from a conventional perspective. And there's substantial room for innovation to help move things along, which is again one of the reasons why we're excited about Harvest. But beyond that, just the capital requirements are just enormous. And we've been running analyses, looking out to 2045, how do we decarbonize everything and so forth. And we figured, well, if we do, a quarter of the building stock on the residential side, it's going to take $2 billion in capital. So that's what we're starting to turn our attention to, in addition to the innovation moves, is how do we address the capital problem? Program design is going to be very, very important to integrate that in a way that makes it seamless for customers to execute. And there's an increasing amount of attention and interest around turnkey programs. Imagine long-lived warranty and cycles where it's almost like as a service kind of experience for homeowners, something that exists in the commercial space but not in the residential space. So these are some concepts that we're starting to be interested in, because it's very challenging to get not only the customers but the entire supply chain, where contractors today are like, what's a heat pump water heater? I'm going to charge you $2,000 more just because it's a heat pump water heater, and I don't normally install those things. So there are a lot of issues like that we need to resolve.
I just want to add to that, if that's okay. So I think, traditionally the challenge is a lot about the costs, and many of the electric solutions that are being developed and heat pumps which are performing very well are pretty much a wash from a cost perspective. And that's where innovation is really important and beneficial. As I mentioned before, I'm a strong proponent of systems such as thermal storage. And just as an example, with the Harvest thermal system, by controlling thermal storage, by controlling a single heat pump and thermal storage, we're able to shift the load, which is of course beneficial for the grid, but we're also able for the ratepayer to minimize their bills. For example, the system reduces emissions compared to gas by 90%, but also reduces bills sometimes by over 45%. So typically between 30 and 45% reduces their bills. What that means is, although the upfront cost is higher, you do have a payback. And that's really important because it opens the door to financing. It opens the door to programs to really allow this to scale. And I would highlight that it also reduces bills compared to standard heat pump systems. And, of course, allows us to use more of that clean, cheap, and abundant renewable solar electricity that's available on the grid in the middle of the day without necessarily having panels on your roof. It's available on the grid.
Absolutely. And Rochelle, I'd love to hear more about how you're interacting with a lot of innovations in the building and in EVs and in a lot of different sectors. And what are some of the challenges you're seeing with taking these innovations out of the lab and deploying them? And what does that adoption look like? And how are you kind of overcoming some of those obstacles?
Yeah, good question. I would say that most have heard this challenge before, but if you haven't, it's more just like the deployment risk or that validation in a real world setting. So that is, if you may have a compelling innovation, perhaps in the building sector, who is willing to take the risk of installing that from a liability perspective, and who pays for it are largely the questions there that tend to slow things down. So I think if there could be more emphasis or more support on demos, I'd love to hear from Raphael on how you're supporting those things and who pays for it. Would love to learn more there.
Well, the first thing I would say is we love NREL. I've had the pleasure of working with NREL on a number of occasions, and we absolutely look to NREL and the national labs to say, hey, this is something you should look at, because we're way downstream. So yes, we will work with innovative technologies, but they need to be more or less ready for prime time by the time they get to us. And we're not in a position to do a lot of validation. So we do look to the research that is developed by the national labs on kinds of things that we should be considering in our roadmap. And then when companies surface that are in particular areas that align with our roadmap that have already had that kind of validation, it's much easier for us to then say, oh, this is definitely something we should take a look at and consider first for pilot and then possibly broader introduction. So in the case of Harvest Thermal, just to take that example, we have developed a pilot. We are fully funding installation of 5 of these systems in our service territory. As part of that, we are also funding independent measurement and verification. Our goal is to prove the performance, and then we would incorporate that the technology as an offering within our incentive programs. And if we develop turnkey programs, which we have one now for low-income homes, incorporate there as well. Now, usually most new technologies are not, one size fits all. You have to understand, well, what are the conditions under which this particular thing provides real impact? And that's part of what we are aiming to understand. So what are the criteria around which this technology should be applied? What are the various issues? Are there permitting issues, contract training issues, or user acceptance and training issues? And usually there are. So we do look at it holistically in terms of trying to address all of those components. And at this point, as I mentioned, most of our funding for pilots like this, we provide ourselves. Of course, it's always helpful if someone walks in the door with some funding. The biggest issue really is around things like warranty. And we need to have some level of confidence that if something goes wrong, that the customer will be made whole somehow. And that's something that we work through all our pilots on and have done so with Harvest.
And maybe I could just talk a little bit of the journey of Harvest, because we've taken this product from the lab and we're now, I'd say, on the cusp of commercialization. And it really goes through, I'd say, a tried and tested roadmap of, as we as a society say we want to tackle certain problems that are important to us, there is a map that has been deployed before, and that's really, how do we support that development, maturation, and cost reduction of these new capabilities? And that includes things, that Harvest has benefited from. That first of all, the R&D opportunity, the R&D grant. Of course, we're bootstrapping, but a National Science Foundation Award really helped us start to get initial pilots in the field. And then working with organizations such as the California Energy Commission, who have a significant stake in trying to make sure we find solutions quickly and cost effectively, and that we're able to address a problem in an equitable way. So working in partnership with them to deploy more systems and mature the technology. And then finally, we're working, of course, with Peninsula Clean Energy and Raphael's team, deploying 5 systems in their territory. And that has brought us to the commercialization phase, to the point that starting in January this coming year, 2022, we will be commercializing our pods. A lot of them will be going to early adopters, to people who are enthusiastic about getting gas out of their homes immediately. but it is beginning to allow us to scale and really prove the performance of the system in the commercial space. So it is that national grants, local utilities, and so on has really helped us grow. I would say in parallel, though, given the importance of climate change, a lot is happening in this space to really help steer the market in the direction that we need. So I'm thinking of, say, rate schedules, time of use rates, which are kind of aligning both the pain and the benefits between the utilities and the homeowners. Let's not use electricity when it's most expensive and when it's dirtiest. And that, of course, allows us to provide an offering that helps homeowners automatically benefit from that. And that's one example. And I would like to say regarding homeowner behavior, behavior is a powerful thing, but it's very difficult to plan for, particularly if it's voluntary. And so I would emphasize that this has to be automatic. This has to happen without people having to worry about it. They have too many other things to worry about. So we need automatic controls. We need to be able to monitor it, make sure things are working properly. But this is not another burden we need to be putting on homeowners who have enough things to worry about.
So we're also talking about how we can make kind of access to a lot of these clean energy solutions equitable. And I'd love to hear more about either of your thoughts on how we can make electrification equitable, and that can include what kinds of programs, incentives, models are looking promising. And as a follow-up, we are also talking about a lot of these solutions are easy or more accessible for homeowners to implement, but we know that a majority of residents are renters. And so what kind of incentives can we put in place or are in place to incentivize landlords and people with rented homes to incorporate electrified solutions?
I think that question might be for me. So we have not yet really started to tackle the question of renters. In general, for lower income and underserved communities, I think as most people are aware, there are just a lot more barriers. And so we're starting with a home upgrade program that's a turnkey program, larger incentive levels, and with an electrification measure, and also layering on other available incentive programs to try to do as much work as possible in a home. And it's focused mostly on homeowners, and it's in part of its intention is to start give us an opportunity to start to develop the experience base. But we know that there are, even with homeowners, we've got at least two big things, and one is trust. There is often distrust of programs that are coming from any number of sources, and that's partly justified because of past experiences that have been negative, where particular loan programs that were not actually customer friendly, high interest rates and the like, or other issues like that. And to address that, it's very important to have local community partners that are trusted to engage the customers and help them along in the customer journey. And then the second thing is many folks are dealing with all sorts of issues. As Jane noted, even under the best cases, right? People have had other things on their mind, and even more so if you're dealing with underserved communities where a home may have many different problems, not just non-energy related. So in fact, our first objective in this program is to help address tangible needs in the home, which might be health and safety issues. So they might have a mold problem. They might have, a staircase to the front door that's falling apart. And we have to make sure in these programs to provide tangible benefits. Because if we just replace the water heater in simplistic terms, and they had hot water before and they have hot water after, it doesn't mean anything to them, right? So I think the programs have to provide real meaningful benefits. And then the rental thing is another layer of complexity, and you know, there are, I think, many different avenues that we have to look at, but one that we are already looking at is on-bill finance programs, and in particular looking forward to tariff on-bill finance, which could be attached to a property and endure account turnover. And in a scenario like that with tariff on-bill finance, then you could imagine technologies such as Harvest and others that are providing economic benefit to then you see a bill savings and then have everything be financed. So that's where we think we can do it.
So
yeah, and if I can speak from a national lab perspective, you know, we are in the midst of this energy transition and we have a legacy grid. And part of the role of the national labs, right, is to develop new emerging energy technologies, but also ensure that the orchestration of those new solutions with the legacy grid infrastructure affords a resilient and reliable grid. So that's one of the key pieces of NREL and the national labs, is to do the cutting edge R&D that enables resilience for various regions of the country and beyond. So that was just my 2 cents on the role of labs there.
can I, Shimon, if it's okay, can I just add a little thought on that as well? Thank you, Rochelle. Regarding the whole affordability piece, this is also something that needs to go in right at the start of product engineering. And so it's we need to have it in every program, but it really has to be part of the entrepreneur's DNA. And of course, you know, people want their product to be usable by as many people as possible, right? You know, I think most entrepreneurs will support equity and support making their solutions available to as many people as possible. But in the busyness and hard work of developing a company, sometimes you can lose sight of that because you're solving so many other problems. And what I've found has been really helpful to keep us focused on that has been the role of the regulators, has been the role of the bodies such as NREL or National Science Foundation or the California Energy Commission or others, keeping our feet to the fire, saying, here's a great grant program. By the way, it has to be deployable in this teeny tiny tank closet. And so think about how you can make your product fit there, which means instead of making, you know, we have a control system, we call it the Harvest Pod. Instead of making this a big flat device that looks like a Tesla Powerwall that fits on your garage, we've made it compact. It's like a shoebox and it fits in a tank closet so that people in small apartments can install it as well. And that was really, I mean, of course we wanted to do it, but what really made it the highest priority was the work of all these organizations saying, you need to do this. And I think that's really helpful. They need to carry on doing that.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think it's crucial to have that reminder of you need to always be thinking about the user and what their needs are at every stage of innovation and deployment. And that's really how adoption will be successful. We have a number of questions coming in from the audience. So if anyone wanted to add something to that before we move on to some audience questions, please do. All right, so we have the first question is for Rochelle, I'm assuming. So what technology areas is NREL mainly focused on these days? And is that likely to change if we get more federal funding flowing?
Excellent question. Yeah, so a lot of our core capabilities really reside in the energy efficiency and renewable energy pieces. I would say that we've seen a later shift towards orchestration or better integration or grid modernization, if you will, of those solutions. So how do we develop what's called autonomous energy systems? How do they link together and communicate? So you can think of our shift in our research in that sense. We've also incorporated a lot of new research around storage, going back to Raphael's earlier points on storage, lowering costs, whether that's through lithium ion or other types of chemistries or configurations such as flow batteries. I would also say beyond just the public funding or the federal funding piece, NREL has seen a large drive in some of our external partnerships. To highlight one, for example, we worked with the city of LA to scope their electrification strategy as a city as a whole. So that was one example. We've also seen partnerships, for example, with Dallas-Fort Worth, focused on the mobility of the airport. And how do you do that from an energy perspective? So we've definitely seen an uptick, not only in federal funding, but also some of the external private partnerships that we focus on as well.
Thanks so much. And the next question, I think, is for Rafael. So how do we get more utilities involved in trying out new innovations in support of their commercialization?
So traditional utilities in that the regulated arm of traditional utilities typically have very long lead processes and may have, particular emerging technology programs. In California, the emerging technology ETCC, I'm not remembering the acronym now, is the investor-owned utilities, principal emerging technology program. The challenge for new technology companies is that typically you're thinking about, your imminent need to get to customers and develop revenue. And the utility programs are frankly not well suited towards that sort of immediacy. So that's very challenging. Now it can be done. So if you have a technology that is promising, that it's scalable, particularly software-based technologies, and you have some runway, right? And that runway may be funding from different sources. The great thing about an investor-owned utility is its capacity for enormous scale, right? So if you get through their process, which could be many, many months, right, or years, then at the end of the day, you could have, enormous applications. So you think of companies like Full Power, right, which was a software-based solution. They came in, did a pilot with Pacific Gas and Electric, and Pacific Gas and Electric says great, and they incorporated it into their program. Boom, massive volume. However, that's not the situation that most technology companies, smaller technology companies, are in. I would say again, the community choice energy agencies are a good place for what I would describe as endpoint technologies that are pretty close to commercialization, right? Where actually you're testing something that's actually ready to test in the field. And that could be done pretty quickly, and that could be incorporated quite quickly. We're not a good candidate for technologies that are upstream technologies. So there are programs in California, for example, for the Cal test bed, funded by the California Energy Commission and things like that, where you can get some validation and move along in the supply chain. So those are probably better programs for more upstream technologies. I'm not sure I exactly answered your question, because there are several different pieces there, but hopefully that helps.
That's helpful. And there's kind of a question that adds to that a little bit in a way. How do you go about establishing public trust for various projects, especially as new companies? And this is based on your comment earlier about public motivation, cost, capital, etc.
Well, when dealing with something new, the first thing is to be very careful about the scale of the introduction. As Dane noted, the pilot that we're jointly working on, we did a pretty targeted outreach. Most of the participants in that pilot are eager early adopters, very enthusiastic. You want to have that kind of validation first before you go beyond that. So that's number one. Number two, the risks have to be mitigated. So, is there an out-of-pocket cost or not? Preferably if it's something really new, not to have out-of-pocket costs for the customer. If something goes wrong, again, that has to be addressed, so that has to be built in. And then looking beyond on more scaled introduction, right? Then you want to wrap around all the other things into that, right? But in addition to a warranty, you want to showcase solutions and start to educate the public through those sorts of vehicles, and try to make it economically attractive, and make sure that it will actually deliver tangible benefits. And that takes time to build that sort of confidence. But I think with careful design, you can do that.
Thanks so much for that. And Jane, we have a question from you from Jim Hudson. When will Harvest Thermal start to scale beyond Northern California, and what sort of challenges do you anticipate when you are growing Harvest Thermal?
That's a great question. It is always tempting when you're running a startup to try and be everything for everybody, and certainly Oregon and the whole of the West Coast and other geographies I think would be very appealing, very have the right policies in place and so on, and I'm looking forward to transitioning there just as soon as we can. However, having spent 13 years in startups, I know that one of the things that can hurt a startup at the beginning and therefore reduce the impact that you can have in the longer term is the lack of focus. So certainly for the first year, we will be focusing on Northern California, although we are having a few pilot deployments in other parts of the state as well. But looking beyond that, maybe in the 2023 timeframe, we could certainly scale to other locations, but it will be focused really from a geographic perspective to allow us to execute extremely well, learn, build all the trainings, make sure we learn from our installer experience, our contractor experience, so that the whole deployment approach from manufacturing, delivery, installation, support is honed and tested in a geography that I control before going much beyond that.
Thanks so much. And we have an interesting question. What are some technology trends that are not only meant to green the grid, but also take into account some natural risks like flooding, hurricanes, earthquakes in adoption at household and community levels, where climate change damages affect the most? So I'll let anyone who wants to take that go ahead.
I'll chime in on the renewable front. One of the things that we've seen is an uptick of installations of wind and solar on bodies of water, whether that's lakes or ocean. Looking at new deployments of solar and wind, I think could be one category of that, and hoping to answer your question.
All right, thanks so much. And I think we're nearing the end of the hour here. And so thanks so much for joining us with this conversation. And I'm gonna make some space for any kind of parting thoughts or messages you'd like to leave the audience with before we close out.
So I just want to really thank yourself and the whole of the Virtue Labs crew. I think this has been a great event. So thank you very much for that, and really just tell the audience that the solutions are there, they're coming, and I expect that in the next 10 years, we will utterly transform this space. So we can do this together.
And I would add to the innovators out there, there's also, at the same time solutions are there, there's also a huge opportunity for innovation. So that sounds contradictory, but it's really not. There's, even with conventional concepts of things, rearranging those conventional concepts into new ways of doing things to drive down the costs and improve service levels is enormously important. And so there's lots of room to run, and I think that the opportunities are going to grow as more capital and attention starts to shift, which it inevitably will. So by all means, go after the market.
Yeah, I follow Raphael's sentiment. There's plenty of problems to solve and plenty of innovation to tap still. I'm excited to see what our energy infrastructure will look like 20 years from now. I'm sure there'll be new inventions and new innovations that we hadn't even thought of right now. So definitely encourage creativity and innovation and startup opportunities. And really appreciative to be part of this panel. It's a good time to be in clean tech broadly, or the sector broadly.
Thanks so much for all of your time and joining us with this engaging discussion. And sounds like there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm really hopeful that we have leaders like you kind of taking charge of the space. And we had a lot of questions, more than we had time to answer on this panel, but we have a networking session right after this where you'll have some time to kind of meet the panelists and others in the conference. So I'll hand it back to Miguel to tell you a little more about that. But thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Shimol, and a big thanks to you, Jane, Rochelle, and Raphael. It's a critical panel and critical questions. I'm so excited to see all of the attendees asking your questions and being actively involved. And a special thanks to everyone at Virtual Lab for all of your hard work behind the scenes and on the panels today. It's been a fun day, and it's just flown by. You know, in closing for me, this morning was really special. I officially became an uncle for the first time. And as I think about the world that little fellow is going to be a part of, I'm appreciative of each of you for your thinking, for your fight, and for collaborating to make that next generation have a better chance. So it's been an especially meaningful day. And on behalf of the Virtual Lab board, it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Again, my name is Miguel Sosa, and if you are ever in Portland and want to catch up to have that conversation continued, go for a bike ride, do let me know. Now remember, tomorrow is a special day, so we'll be here to hear from the graduating cohort of the Cascadia Clean Tech Accelerator, as well as 5 up-and-coming climate entrepreneurs launching their businesses for the greatest impact. So join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific to see these amazing startups. And again, a reminder, this event is free, but Virtual Lab is a nonprofit, and we make that happen through the support of great people like Slalom and each of you. So we thank you for any donations you can help with today to keep our entrepreneur support systems going and to make that impact. You'll see again that chat post on where you can donate. Thanks, Cassidy. And finally, I want to just share that we have one last networking opportunity. Hope that you enjoy it. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you. Continue doing the great things out there and have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.